"Excuse me, sir, the cars here are quite expensive. Are you just looking for fun?" Arthur, looking straight and calm, "I'm not looking for fun, I'm looking to buy." The old man walked into the showroom in worn-out shoes and a faded military jacket. The staff glanced at him and sneered, whispered, ignored, probably asking for water or looking for a cool place to sit in the air conditioning. Look at that guy, he probably doesn't even have a driver's license. No one knew that the man they had just despised had risked his life for this country. And just 40 minutes later, everything was completely reversed. A commanding voice shattered the silence. "Is that the man who saved my life?" At the tip of the Havenport Peninsula, where the silver waves crashed day and night against the gray stone shore, there lived a man named Arthur Blake. People often saw him sitting in front of his small wooden cabin, cloth in hand, carefully polishing old oars. Arthur wasn't a famous boat builder, nor did he own any kind of shop, but whenever someone in Havenport needed to fix up their worn-out fishing boat, they came to him. Arthur had once served in the Navy, fighting in the Gulf War. In his youth, he sailed aboard massive warships, braving storms, gunfire, and endless days without a glimpse of land. Folks said he had the eyes of the sea, deep and always listening. Maybe that's why, even decades after the war had ended, Arthur never left the water. Only now, instead of commanding steel giants, he patiently cared for each plank of wood, a quiet connection to his past. Arthur's life was a simple one. He had no family of his own. The woman he had once loved and who had waited for him back home had passed away many years ago from illness. It was said that after her death, Arthur no longer thought about starting a new family. Instead, he chose to devote his time to his small community, especially to the Havenport Veterans Community Center. Every Saturday afternoon, Arthur would push open the plain wooden door of the community center, a modest place where silver-haired men with trembling hands gathered, their eyes still bright with stories from long ago. He didn't talk much. Instead, he quietly brewed coffee, set up chairs, and sometimes sat patiently, listening as someone recalled a fading memory, a handwritten letter from the front lines, a friend who never made it home. Arthur knew that the wounds of war didn't just scar the body, they etched themselves deep into the soul. In Havenport, Arthur wasn't wealthy, nor was he someone who stood out. He made a living from odd jobs, fixing boats, and relied on a modest government pension. But no one in town thought of him as poor. They knew that wherever Arthur was, there was strength, loyalty, and a kind of quiet patience that was rare in today's fast-paced world. One early autumn day, as the wind began to carry a chill from the sea into town, Arthur decided it was time for a new vehicle. Not because he cared about anything flashy, but because his legs had started to betray him. Old war wounds throbbed with every change in the weather. A long-awaited trip to Horizon Motors was arranged. Arthur didn't expect much. All he needed was a used SUV, something sturdy, like the life he had lived. What he didn't know was that this trip would lead to a story that the town of Havenport would talk about for years to come. Arthur Blake never been one to let go of old habits easily. For the past 10 years, he'd been driving the same '85 pickup. The engine sputtered like a wheezing dolphin offshore. But the human body has its limits. The legs that once gripped the deck of a ship in stormy seas now struggled to carry him up even the gentlest hills in town. The cold Havenport mornings made the old wounds in Arthur's knees ache like they were frozen solid. After months of hesitation and a few gentle nudges from friends at the community center, Arthur finally decided it was time for a change. He pulled out his small savings book, the one where he'd tucked away spare change from years of fixing boats. It wasn't a large sum, but to Arthur it was enough to buy a used SUV, as long as the engine was solid and the seats stayed warm in winter. That evening at the community center, surrounded by the low murmur of veteran conversations and the faint scent of cinnamon waffles, Arthur shared with everyone that he was thinking of buying a car. Sitting next to him was Evan Carter, a young man in his early 20s, the center's newest volunteer. Evan had grown up in Havenport, but after studying automotive engineering in the city, he decided to return home, committed to the community he loved. After hearing the story, Evan immediately volunteered. "Let me drive you to Horizon Motors, sir. That dealership has a good reputation, and I know a few people there. You won't have to worry about being overcharged or picking the wrong car." Arthur chuckled, his eyes reflecting gratitude mixed with a hint of embarrassment. He didn't like to trouble anyone, but he also knew he wasn't as strong as he used to be. So they agreed to set out together the following Saturday morning. To Arthur, this trip wasn't just about buying a car. It felt like a small milestone in his life. The first time in years he was choosing to step beyond the quiet borders of Havenport with the company of someone from a newer generation. That night, Arthur sat by the window of his wooden cottage, listening to the gentle lap of waves and the wind brushing against the old shingles. He smiled, his fingers resting on an old photo of him and his fellow sailors hanging on the wall. Life, whether slow-moving or stormy, always had a way of turning unexpected corners. Arthur never imagined that something as simple as buying a car could lead him into a story he couldn't yet see the end of. Outside the window, the moon shimmered over the Havenport sea like a quiet promise. "This journey won't be a simple one, Arthur." On Saturday morning, the sky over Havenport was an unusually clear blue, with sunlight spilling gently across the small street like a golden silk scarf. Arthur Blake stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his faded denim shirt. Draped over his shoulder was his old navy jacket, still bearing the worn silver insignia on the left chest, something Arthur carried like an inseparable piece of his life. On his feet were well-worn leather shoes, their soles thinned by years of wear, now dulled like the memories Arthur kept quietly tucked away in his heart. Evan arrived right on time, his small Jeep bouncing gently along the pothole-riddled road. He flashed an encouraging smile. "I have a feeling you're going to find the perfect car today." Arthur returned a gentle smile and slowly climbed into the passenger seat. During the short drive to Horizon Motors, he didn't say much, simply gazing out at the roadside trees just beginning to bud with spring. In his mind, he thought to himself, "I just need a car that can get me to the harbor each morning, and sometimes to the community center." When they arrived, Arthur furrowed his brow slightly. Horizon Motors stood before them like a crystal palace in the heart of the city, gleaming glass panels, rows of new and used SUVs lined up like silver chess pieces under the sun. He and Evan stepped into the showroom. The glass doors slid open, and soft background music greeted them. But it seemed that was the only welcome Arthur would receive. Inside, young salespeople with slicked-back hair and crisp shirts smelling of expensive cologne gave him a cursory glance before turning away. A group of three stood near the reception desk, lattes in hand, laughing and chatting about their weekend plans, ignoring Arthur and Evan as if they were shadows. Arthur stood tall, his back straight, his eyes patient but carrying a quiet sadness. His faded military jacket and worn shoes stood out awkwardly in that polished space. Like an old story that had wandered into a world with no room for it anymore, Evan, sensing the moment, stepped forward. "I'll find someone to help us," he said. But before he could speak to anyone, a blonde salesman, eyes glued to his phone, brushed past them and muttered without looking up, "Used cars are out back. Take a look. If you need anything, talk to the front desk." Arthur sat down on a glossy leather chair in the corner of the waiting area, as quietly as a small stone resting by the edge of a stream. He placed his faded fabric cap on his knee, his calloused hands folded together, eyes following each car that passed by the glass windows. No one approached him. No one offered him a drink. But Arthur didn't mind. At his age, he had learned that patience was the most faithful companion. From the reception desk, soft laughter drifted through the mellow background music. A young employee, hair slicked back and shirt tailored tight, leaned over and muttered to a coworker, not bothering to lower his voice, "Bet that old guy just came in for the free water." A snicker followed, sharp as a needle pricking the already frosty air. Or maybe just for the free AC. "Look at him. Probably doesn't even have a license." Arthur heard every word, every snort of laughter. He simply bowed his head a little lower, as if studying his worn-out shoes. But in truth, he was trying to hide the quiet sting spreading in his chest. It didn't stop there. The receptionist, blonde curls and fiery red nails, walked over, her face forced into politeness, though her eyes brimmed with irritation. "Hello, sir," she said, her voice syrupy and fake. "If you're just resting, please make room for customers who actually need assistance." Each syllable of actually need assistance landed like a blade against Arthur's pride, already worn thin from years of quiet endurance. He looked up, calm, gray blue eyes steady, and gave a small nod. All right, young lady. Arthur returned to his seat, this time in a more secluded corner of the showroom. The snickers and indifferent glances from the young staff still drifted around him like the cold morning fog off the Havenport coast. From the pocket of his worn navy coat, he pulled out a small wooden box, polished smooth over the years by his own calloused hands. It was just big enough to hold what mattered most: a Medal of Honor and a handwritten letter from the Navy commander commending his exceptional service during the Gulf campaign. Arthur ran his fingers gently across the lid before opening it. Light from the showroom windows glinted off the silver surface of the medal. The letter, its cursive script both sharp and dignified, had yellowed with age and was neatly folded beneath. Whenever the world grew too cold, Arthur would reach for this box as if it were a quiet fire burning in the winter dark. It reminded him that real worth wasn't in the eyes of others, but in what he had given, things only the sea and his comrades truly understood. A young employee walked past, iced coffee in hand, casting a quick glance at the box. He smirked, didn't bother to ask a thing, and kept walking, the rubber soles of his shoes scuffing against the glossy floor. No one asked Arthur about the box. No one was curious about the bright silver medal or the carefully folded letter. To them, he was just an old, poor man, a speck of dust lost in the sleek room of hurried transactions. Arthur didn't mind. He simply smiled quietly, closed the box, and tucked it back into the pocket close to his heart. All the glory, all the pain, all the losses he had endured, now they were all wrapped up in silence. Evan turned around from across the room, holding 2 glasses of water. When he saw Arthur sitting there, calm and composed, his eyes briefly tightened. Evan said nothing, only handed Arthur a glass of water as if offering an unspoken apology. "I don't understand how they could," Evan muttered, sitting down beside him. Arthur chuckled softly, his voice warm like the waves crashing against the rocks. "Don't blame them, son," he said. "People can't see what their hearts aren't big enough to hold." The two of them sat quietly amid the gleaming new cars and the distant murmurs of strangers. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the light breeze from the front door. A salty wind like the sea breeze of Havenport, a salty wind like memory. The automatic glass door slid open, and a light breeze rushed in, carrying with it the low hum of the engine from the glossy black Range Rover that had just parked by the curb. The luxurious vehicle stood out sharply among the older SUVs outside the showroom. From his seat, Arthur looked up. A man in his early 50s stepped in, tall with neatly combed graying hair. His charcoal gray suit fit perfectly, accentuating his dignified presence. His polished leather shoes and confident yet unpretentious demeanor marked his entrance. The atmosphere in the showroom shifted instantly. The young sales staff, who had been lazily chatting moments before, quickly straightened their ties, stood up straight, and their faces lit up as though an invisible command had just been issued. "Good afternoon, Mr. Quinn." The receptionist hurried over, her smile so bright it almost seemed forced. "It's a pleasure to welcome you today." Thomas Quinn nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the room as if he were a captain used to commanding large ships, always alert to every subtle movement on deck. Arthur quietly observed, without a hint of envy or comparison. He understood people like Thomas, those who had risen from the lowest rungs of society, who could truly deserve the positions they held, if their hearts still carried kindness. Thomas didn't come alone. Behind him, a young man, dressed more casually but exuding a certain polished demeanor, followed closely. That was Carter, Thomas's personal assistant, a former military serviceman, much like Arthur. As Thomas and Carter walked deeper into the showroom, every eye in the room turned toward them. The quickest sales associate hurried forward, offering a hand to introduce the latest SUV, the model currently displayed in the center of the hall. But Thomas wasn't in a rush. His gaze settled on Arthur, the older man in the worn naval jacket, still holding his glass of water with a quiet grip, his calm eyes speaking volumes that words could not express. Thomas froze as he clearly saw Arthur's face. For a moment, it was as though the entire showroom blurred in his vision. Only the image of the elderly man remained, with his faded jacket and serene gaze. Carter, standing behind, noticed the change in Thomas's demeanor and raised an eyebrow in confusion. Meanwhile, the other salespeople began to murmur. "What's going on?" one of them whispered. "Does he know that old man?" Ignoring the curious glances around him, like Thomas quickly walked toward Arthur, his face suddenly filled with emotion. He stopped just a few steps in front of Arthur, as though afraid any sudden movement might shatter this strange moment. Arthur looked up, his gray eyes reflecting surprise. "Excuse me, sir. May I help you?" He began in his gravelly voice, worn by the years. But before Arthur could finish his sentence, Thomas spread his arms wide and, without hesitation, embraced him. The entire showroom seemed to freeze. The giggles, the contemptuous glances that had been present just moments ago were now frozen on everyone's faces. Even the receptionist, who had just told Arthur not to bother the real customers, stood rooted to the spot like a statue. Thomas held Arthur tightly in his strong embrace. His voice choked up. "Mr. Arthur, it's you, the man who saved my life all those years ago." Arthur was bewildered. He gently pulled back, squinting as he looked at the man before him. The years had changed many things, but now he remembered. The young, curly-haired second lieutenant, naive during the Gulf raid, the one who had nearly lost his life under heavy fire if not for Arthur pulling him out of the line of fire. "Thomas? Thomas Quinn?" Arthur said, his voice hoarse. Thomas nodded, his eyes welling with tears. "If it weren't for you that day, I might not be standing here. You didn't just save my life, you gave me this life." Carter smiled quietly, nodding as if confirming the truth before the confused onlookers around them. A heavy silence filled the showroom. The young salespeople who had been so quick to look down on the elderly man in shabby clothes now had their heads bowed, too ashamed to speak. Before Arthur could react, Thomas turned to face the frozen crowd. "This," he declared, his voice resonating throughout the room, "is one of the true heroes of this country. None of you have any right to disrespect him." Arthur's face flushed slightly. He wasn't used to such loud praise, and he certainly wasn't used to being the center of attention. But inside, a strange warmth began to stir, like an old flame that had long been dormant, now suddenly igniting. Thomas loosened his embrace and patted Arthur gently on the shoulder, as if to reassure both himself and his old mentor. He turned away, his eyes bright, pulling his phone from the pocket of his suit jacket and dialing a number decisively. The atmosphere in the showroom seemed to freeze. The salespeople, the receptionist, even the shift manager who stood hiding behind the office glass door, all kept their eyes fixed on the powerful man acting before them. Thomas didn't step outside to make the call. He stood right there in the showroom in front of everyone, his deep and firm voice filling the space. "Hello, Lewis. I need you to do something for me right now. Send an offer to buy Horizon Motors at the price I previously mentioned. No negotiations. I want to finalize the deal in 15 minutes. Make it fast." On the other end of the line, his partner sounded surprised. "Right now, Mr. Quinn?" "Right now," Thomas emphasized, his gaze flicking quickly to Arthur, who still hadn't fully grasped what was happening. He hung up and turned back, offering Arthur a warm smile, as if this were just another small matter in an ordinary day. Arthur shook his head in confusion. "Thomas, you don't have to do this." Thomas waved his hand, his voice firm but filled with affection. "You've done more than this for me. Let me repay you with this small favor." Across the room, Carter held his breath. The receptionist began to slowly step back towards the counter, her face pale. The young salespeople huddled in a group, their expressions a mix of shock and fear. Not even 15 minutes later, just as Thomas had said, the showroom manager's phone rang. He fumbled to answer, his eyes constantly flicking toward Thomas and Arthur. The call ended quickly. The manager stepped out, his voice trembling, announcing, "Effective immediately, Horizon Motors is officially under the ownership of Mr. Thomas Quinn." The room seemed to explode in shock. The salespeople stammered. Some tried to force fake smiles. A few sneaked texts on their phones, likely sharing the news with others. Thomas stepped forward into the center of the showroom, his voice loud and strong. "Arthur will be treated as the highest VIP customer here, and I expect everyone to show him absolute respect. If anyone feels they can't do that—" He paused, his gaze sharp. "The door is there." No one dared to move. Arthur, still slightly stunned, could only smile softly and shake his head, his eyes filled with warmth and gratitude. For the first time in many years, he wasn't just seen as an old war veteran, but as a person of worth in this cold modern world. Arthur stood frozen in the middle of the showroom, as if he had just stepped out of a strange dream. Everything had happened so fast, so unexpectedly. He had come simply to look at an old SUV, and now he stood beside his former student, now a wealthy businessman, while the entire showroom held its breath, waiting. Thomas placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a smile never leaving his face. "Master Arthur," he said, his voice echoing throughout the room, "choose any car you like. Second, whether it's the most expensive or the newest model, any one of them is my small thank you, and the first gift from Horizon Motors in this new chapter." Arthur shook his head, his deep eyes shimmering with emotion. "Thomas, I don't need that much. I just intended to buy a used SUV, something easy to drive and fuel efficient." "You can have an old one if you want," Thomas laughed, "but someone like you shouldn't leave the showroom with anything halfway." As Arthur slowly walked past the row of cars, now greeted by respectful looks and polite greetings, his hand brushed the hood of a silver Range Rover. Not because it was the most expensive, but because it reminded him of the desert patrols from years ago. Dusty, harsh, and resilient. "This one," Arthur said quietly, almost to himself. Thomas nodded immediately, turning to a nearby sales assistant who had been anxiously standing by. "Get the car washed, checked thoroughly, and make sure the gas tank is full." The young assistant, who had snickered earlier when seeing Arthur, now bowed his head and hurried off as if his earlier actions had been erased. Thomas stepped up to a small platform in the middle of the showroom and clapped his hands twice to grab everyone's attention. "I want everyone to hear this clearly. From today, Horizon Motors will implement a new program, Veterans Appreciation. Not just discounts or promotions. We will retrain the entire staff on respect, how to serve those who have sacrificed for our country, and most importantly, how to see a person through their character, not by the clothes or shoes they wear." A few people began to clap. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The distant glances that had once been there were now replaced with regret. A female employee whispered to the person next to her, "He served in the Gulf War." Arthur stood next to Thomas, looking around, where he had sat alone just minutes ago, being ridiculed, now seemed to glow, not because of the cars, but because someone had remembered gratitude. He gave a soft, gentle smile. Not for the car, but for something much bigger, recognition. The next morning, as the sun rose above the horizon over the ocean, a group of workers quietly set up a new sign in front of the showroom. The golden lettering shone brightly in the sunlight. Blake, Quinn Motors, built on gratitude and dedication. Arthur's name, Blake, was placed first. Not because he was rich or powerful, but because he was the one who planted the seed. The seed of kindness, silent sacrifice, and patience that required no proof. Throughout the day, the story of the old man in military clothes being looked down upon, and the unexpected reunion between teacher and his former student spread rapidly on social media. People shared images of Arthur sitting quietly, then stepping out with his new car, alongside Thomas, the young soldier from years ago. The press called it a lesson in respect and dignity in an era of haste. Many people visited the dealership not to buy a car, but to meet the man who had made an entire system reconsider itself. As for Arthur, he still lived in Havenport, still fixed boats, still brewed tea for friends at the community center. The only difference was that every morning he drove his silver Range Rover along the coastal road with a quiet belief. Kindness had never gone out of style, and respect, when sown at the right time, would bloom in places no one expected.